Good morning, everybody. We'll make a start. So welcome, first of all, everyone, to the cubesys discussion series, which is about unlocking compliance excellence with the Essential 8 from the ASCS. I'm currently, we're going to do a quick round of introductions, but before we get started, wanted to talk about a few things. Obviously, today's format is a discussion-based format. So today is being recorded and will be shared after the session. Please feel free to add any questions you might have into the chat window. We've got a few people on standby who may be able to provide text-based responses, or they'll raise our attention to those questions as we go through our conversation. We have some experts here with us today, so we'll have them introduce themselves in just a moment. And feel free to engage with us and ask the questions that you've come to this session to obviously have answered. What I might do really quickly is introduce myself, and then I'll ask our other two guests to introduce themselves and give us a brief description and brief rundown. So my name's Chris Hales. I'm a senior cloud consultant here at cubesys. I've been working in the IT industry for roughly 15, 20 years. I have a very strong background in network infrastructure, security, storage, and servers. So a very broad infrastructure and IT background. Started in the world of networking and Cisco, and built my way around through into Windows and then into cloud eventually. So really strong background in IT operations in particular, and being a part of a broader team where you have to have those hybrid skill sets. Later in life, I've now started to focus a little bit more purely in the security components of the cloud in particular. And the Essential 8 is a fairly passionate, I guess, topic for me. I find that it is a very unique set of framework that I think a lot of businesses are still struggling to fully understand. So I'm hoping that we can demystify that today a little bit. So I'll kick it over to Alex. Yeah, do you want to just give us a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Alex Rizzo. I'm a sales engineer for Skykick. My background is actually I come from the IT support and operations world. About a decade ago, got stuck in there, and then slowly over time developed a keen interest in security. Actually, picked up a few certifications. Took about a year off to sort of run my own business, do a bit of freelance work, and then decided to make the plunge and join a vendor. And I've been at Skykick for about a year and a half. And as a sales engineer, I guess my job is to act as a bridge between the product and development teams and our sales team as well. So, communicating about product features and benefits to a variety of different audiences, both technical and non-technical.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex, for coming and being a part of this today.
Thanks for having me.
Kenny, do you want to give us a quick intro?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, absolutely. Good morning, all. It's really good to connect with all of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Kenny Singh. I'm from Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for about 12 years. Currently, I'm the Director for Cybersecurity and Privacy for the Customer Success Division for Microsoft Australia and New Zealand. I've had quite a variety of roles at Microsoft. I started with Microsoft Consulting Services, so I was a senior architect in Microsoft Consulting Services for many years. Then I moved across to our partner enablement organization, and I had the incredible privilege to work with cubesys for many years, which is absolutely fantastic. Then go to market and now customer success. So my team is a team of cybersecurity architects. They specialize in end-to-end cybersecurity, spanning identity and access management, threat protection, cloud security, cyber risk management, so all the different disciplines of cybersecurity. And we work with customers across Australia and New Zealand, and incredibly closely with our Microsoft partners like cubesys. So that's me. Thanks for the opportunity,
Awesome.
Chris.
No, it's great to have you both here. So the Essential 8 is today's topic, and we're going to have a conversation. The three of us are going to engage in conversation around the different controls. So I've just realized it doesn't come back to where I want it to come back to. That's okay. So I'll flick to here. So the different controls of the Essential 8. Now, the Essential 8 is essentially, and I'm going to say essentially a lot, it's 8 separate controls, right? 8 separate controls that every business needs to consider when it comes to implementing a understanding or a framework that's going to provide them with a secure environment for their users, for their devices, and for their systems. So on the screen, you see in front of you ultimately the mitigations themselves, or the 8 criteria, or the 8 controls, the user resistance, the upfront cost, and the ongoing maintenance. Now, there's probably a little bit more of a Microsoft lens to this one, because obviously Microsoft do a lot of the individual components here. Skykeek, as you would have heard from Alex, is predominantly in that daily backup kind of scenario, but in a protect and recover kind of approach, which is also an incredibly important part of when we're implementing controls to make sure that we have, very high level or very basically a backup, right, to make sure that we can restore from somewhere in the event of it being needed. So we're going to dive into them. I think what we should do is talk about each one individually and have a conversation around challenges, potentially the product that would be used to implement certain controls, or have an understanding. And I can talk from a bit of a partner and a customer perspective of things that I've seen inside the industry and inside the market. I'll ask Kenny and Alex to also give their opinion of what they've seen out there and what each of their products potentially do in some of these spaces. Now, the 8 controls are broken into 3 maturity levels. Now, those 3 maturity levels are a self-assessment, essentially. So you can complete a self-assessment, and you'll see there at the bottom there's some reference links around that, and you'll have an opportunity to see the slides in a bit more detail to have a bit more access to that. But also ultimately partly aligned being the basics of, okay, we aligned to some of it, right? Or we've completed some of these controls. Maturity 2, mostly, and then maturity 3, complete, right? So every part of that control is being completed in some way or another. Now, when we talk about Essential 8, I often want to talk about NIST. Now, I use NIST as an alignment process because NIST is quite a well-known cloud framework, cloud security framework. It's also a really well-structured cloud security framework when it comes to, it's quite simple. It's the 5 different control areas, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And then what I've done across the other vertical here is to show you the Essential 8, right? And to understand a little bit about where certain components, and this is a little bit more cubesified, so this is something that we present to our customers around how can we align Essential 8 and NIST together, right, to achieve certain things. So inside the advanced threat protection, and Kenny might get upset with me here because I'm not saying it's Microsoft Defender, but you might use something like an EDR like Huntress and Threat Locker for your application control, which covers a good portion of that identity protect, detect, respond model for endpoint, right? So then we're specifically talking about desktops and laptops in that instance. And then obviously you've got Alex's vertical there in cloud backup with Skykeek for the protect and recover. So, but you can also see on the far right here, Defender, also really strong at the protect, detect, and respond component, right? So it does do a bit of identity, but I've declassified that a little bit because some of the controls inside identifying is not necessarily what Defender's strength is. So NIST alignment for an Essential 8 is really important because you can see along here, or you might, if you can recall the Essential 8 controls, you might sit here and think about, well, I know the products inside each one of these that would potentially do this. So it's just a high-level overview, right, to give you guys a bit of a taste around that. So the 8 controls, into the meat of today's discussion. The 8 controls are high-level frameworks, and just like every framework, they are interpreted and they are implemented in different ways in different organizations and in different environments. So I guess my first question and my first kind of statement to our panel today would be how, and maybe I can start from this conversation, maybe Kenny, maybe you can, but the relevance and importance of Essential 8 in small, medium business, or even large enterprise. How do you think the uptake of Essential 8 is going? What have you seen inside Microsoft around Essential 8 and inside Microsoft customers? What do you think is the big draw, and how much uptake do you think is it actually getting?
No, thanks, Chris. So look, let me just provide some additional background and context. So we've been doing a lot of work with the AST Essential 8. Me personally, I've actually worked with the AST Essential 8 and the master standard around the AST Essential 8 for many, many years. So let me just please provide some additional context here. So the NIST 80053 equivalent, and NIST 0053 is considered, one of the gold standards globally in cybersecurity standards, is what in Australia we call the AST ISM. So that's the Information Security Manual. So the Australian Signal Directorate's Information Security Manual. When we do, and most of you would have probably heard this, when we do IRAP assessments, so this is an assessment that we do on all Microsoft Cloud services and on-premises services for the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. We basically do it against the Information Security Manual. So we bring in an IRAP assessor, a certified IRAP assessor, and they actually look at all the different cloud services, and they look at the Information Security Manual, and they basically rate where each of these cloud services are with respect to these controls. So the reason why I actually wanted to start there is because if you look at the Information Security Manual from the Australian Signals Directorate, we're actually talking in excess of 1,000 controls. I kid you not. So it's a very comprehensive standard. It resembles quite closely NIST 80053. Obviously, it's contextualized for Australia, our region here, and the specific elements of our region. So the AST Essential 8 is basically 8 specific mitigation strategies that actually map to controls in the Information Security Manual. So we did a lot of work just a few years ago that I was personally involved in, where we basically created an assessment in the Microsoft Compliance Manager tool, which is our governance, risk, and compliance tool. So you can think of it like RSA Archer. And we basically looked at each of the controls that make up the mitigation strategies, the 8 mitigation strategies in AST Essential 8. And they basically were a subset of all the controls specified in the Information Security Manual. So now coming back to Chris's question, right? So I just wanted to give you some background and context on how the Australian regulatory landscape looks with regards to AST Essential 8. So if you think about the adoption of AST Essential 8, what we're actually finding through a lot of global research and through Microsoft, I should actually say Australia and New Zealand research, even independent of Microsoft, what we're actually finding is that over 98% of all successful cyber attacks, and we've actually had a lot of cyber attacks over the last 8 to 12 months in our region, over 98% of all cyber attacks can one way or the other be prevented if we ensure basic cyber hygiene. So the AST Essential 8, that subset of controls from the ISM, is basically the gold standard in Australia to ensure that we get a basic cyber hygiene right. And if we get our basic cyber hygiene right, we've actually covered, close to 98% of the cases. So it's absolutely incredible. Time after time, when our incident response teams go in and they work with customers, what they actually find is that there's a lot of work that can potentially be done in terms of uplifting the cybersecurity posture from a basic hygiene perspective. So the AST Essential 8 adoption over the last few years has been good, but there's still a lot of work that we actually need to do in our region. And all the cyber attacks that we've seen over the last 8 to 12 months, they are, indicative of the fact that we actually have threat actors that are basically exploiting basic cyber hygiene issues, as well as some of the advanced persistent threat mechanisms that we actually see out in the industry. Chris, that was a long-winded answer to your question. I just hope that background and context helped.
Absolutely, it does. And I think it's important to go back to the start of it, right? Which is the fact that there is thousands of controls in this. Alex, I guess from your opinion, how much uptake are we seeing in backups, and how do you guys feel that is important to bring that protection component and that recovery component into the ASD? What's your opinion on that?
Backup's a funny thing, especially with cloud backup. I mean, there was a conception within the market, even up till quite recently, that people didn't think that they needed to back up their Office 365 data, that Microsoft was going to handle it. And they did to an extent, but our product, that's where it thrived when there was a huge uptake of, or a huge movement rather, of shift from on-prem to cloud. That's when obviously there became a need for cloud backup. Obviously, backups are real handy. things like ransomware, for instance, anything that you're going to be able to return to an old version of your data before an attack took place. Having those backups in place will keep you a little bit more resilient. Obviously, it's becoming more and more of a concern as more and more attacks increase, especially related to the Essential 8. More and more, I speak to partners that are doing their own Essential 8 audits now and Essential 8 uplifts and selling them as projects. And some of that is customer driven, some of it is legislation driven. So, any company that has a government contract, I believe, needs to get a minimum maturity level to be able to ensure security. So it's good to see that constant slow, although it is slow, gradual movement towards heightened security as attacks become more frequent.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to kind of highlight that when we talk through these controls, we're talking through, 3 different maturity levels where we're kind of only just kind of starting off. And like you said, the government contracting component where they have to meet a minimum maturity level is really important as well, because that's the government's way to kind of, I guess, essentially force us as businesses to ensure that we're securing our environment and securing our individuals, our staff, our devices from that such a significant amount of cyber attacks that have been occurring over the last few years. And as it continues to ramp up, right, those attacks are not stopping. They're not decreasing by any means. If anything, they're going the opposite direction. Awesome. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to switch up a little bit how I was presenting it, because I feel like it was a little bit clumsy before. So what we'll talk about now is the application whitelisting. So the very first control. So for those that are not familiar with what this means, obviously application whitelisting is about understanding every application that runs on our endpoints and ensuring that we have a whitelist associated to it. So we only allow specific applications to execute, and anything else is denied or blocked from running. Now, there's a few different ways you can implement this. From my experience, AppLocker from Microsoft is a native way of doing that. There are other tools out there. I mentioned one before called ThreatLocker, which is a tool that does something very similar to AppLocker. It learns from the computer, creates its whitelist, and then applies that whitelist. Things that we need to consider about this is also about how we maintain said whitelisting as well. So it's not just about set and forget your SOE as your SOE and that's it. It's also about how we expand on our SOE, because any MOE or SOE that we deploy to our devices is always a starting point. It's never the end. It's always the starting point. So I guess, Kenny and Alex, I guess, again, your opinions here around, and I know that obviously Skykick's a protect and recovery tool, but also your insights in industry around and your customers that I've been talking about this. But Kenny, maybe over to you first. Obviously, Microsoft's got AppLocker, very strong in the market when it comes to this component, and it's a very long-standing product. But is Microsoft doing any further enhancements on AppLocker, or is AppLocker what we go for here?
No, look, it's a great question. So we continue to invest in the AppLocker product, but what we also have now, and it's become specifically front of mind with Windows 11. I think it's I'm just thinking about the exact version of it. It's the version that actually got released in 2022, but I'll just confirm straight after this conversation. I'll actually confirm exactly what version it is. So now it's actually built into Windows 11, and it's called Smart App Control. So it basically allows you to control what you're installing on there. So where I was actually going with that is, what we find is that you have all these tools. So you mentioned ThreatLocker before, Chris. There's AppLocker and Windows Defender application control from Microsoft. What really helps is to think about your cybersecurity strategy in a defense in depth way, or with a defense in depth lens. So what that basically means is, you have the baseline of security that you can implement, basically saying, can these binaries be installed? Can these applications be installed on the computer? And you can, for your endpoints, you can put in place Windows Defender application control policies, or AppLocker policies, or ThreatLocker policies, and a whole raft of other things. But it also helps to then think about how we're actually thinking about, let's say, data exfiltration and web application control beyond that endpoint itself. So what I'm basically saying is that It's very well to control applications of Windows 11. It's very critical, and that's a part of the core ASD Essential 8 control set. But it really helps if you think about how we're also thinking about web applications then, because there's a lot of applications that are actually on the web these days, right? So how are we controlling that? Do we actually have a shadow IT discovery and shadow IT recovery strategy in the organization? And you basically have these solutions called the CASB solutions or Cloud Access Security Broker solutions that basically help you do that. So that multi-pronged strategy really helps. So time after time when we talk to our customers, what we're actually finding is that, yes, the baseline with ASD Essential 8 on the endpoints themselves, App Locker, Defender Application Control, Threat Locker, and a whole raft of other industry solutions can absolutely help. But it actually helps if we take a broader view of the entire digital estate. We think about the web applications, we think about the applications on managed devices, on mobile devices in the organization, and there's lots of solutions available to do that.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's a really good point, though, right? Obviously, Windows 11 and the Smart App Control has definitely uplifted the control and the way that we can implement that control inside our environments. Ultimately, yes, there's always other products out there that will always do something else as well. But I think it's cubesys have always maintained the opinion of native is always the best approach in the first right. And when the native isn't necessarily fit for purpose, then we potentially look at our third-party products. I guess, Alex, do you have anything around this one? Have you seen anything around application control? And I know that Skykick is not necessarily a direct consumer to consumer, right? Obviously, you guys work with partners explicitly, but also there are other tools and tool sets that you guys deploy and publish to allow partners like cubesys and other partners to be able to do more with their cloud security.
That's right. So the Security Manager, which launched late last year, enables partners like cubesys to help manage their Office 365 security and the security standing. We recently released a fair few workflows that are specifically out of the box designed for things like application whitelisting. So, for instance, that in that solution, there's a list of workflows that the partner would run those PowerShell-based commands to enable features like application whitelisting. So I've been seeing that more and more, especially with the uptick in Essential 8 rollout projects. And the Skykick has been continuously developing those out-of-the-box sort of solutions for those sorts of things to hopefully get to a point where you could simply just open the Security Manager and deploy an Essential 8 project, right out of the box.
There you go. Right. So you've even got the automations in place to present that out to partners who can then present that out to their customers, which is
correct.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So they can generate reporting and provide it to a customer who then can potentially provide it to an insurer or some other regulatory requirement there. They've got the paperwork to show that that's been configured as recommended.
Excellent. And obviously, Kenny, the compliance portal also helps us do that as well when we look at the self-assessments and things through Compliance Center.
It does indeed. Yes, it does indeed. So if we go to compliance.microsoft.com, one of the projects that we ran at Microsoft is we basically took the Australian specific regulations and standards. So that included the ASD Essential 8. We have the Information Security Manual there. We have APRA CPS 234 and quite a few other regulations from across Australia and New Zealand. And we basically have assessments in that Compliance Manager tool. So essentially what that assessment does is when you fire up that assessment, it does a lot of automated control assessment, if I may describe it like that, right? So there's the manual control assessment where you can basically go in and you can actually say, look, this is where we think our control implementation is, and you can have an independent entity as in a partner or a vendor come in and do that for you as well. But it also has automated detection. So it can automatically look at Intune. It can automatically look at some of the controls that you actually have applied on the endpoints. I can basically say, I am seeing in your environment that you have these controls. This is what the ASD Essential 8 or this is what the ISM mandates. And this is where you are in your compliance journey. And it helps visualize that with a very simple score. Right, so it actually gives you a compliance score. So it makes it really easy with recommendations to take that score up to what that ideal state is. And we have assessments for each of the different maturity levels. So you have maturity level 1, 2, and 3 for ASD Essential 8 in there.
Cool. There you go. So plenty of visibility around there. So I know that we've focused quite heavily on the application control. I think some of our other controls are going to be quite a shorter conversation, obviously, because I think some of them are pretty much just a known, right? When it comes to most of us are in IT operations, patching your applications is an essential, right? So the next control, patch applications. Ultimately, it's a no-brainer, right? You got to patch your applications, you got to patch your endpoints. When we think about maturity levels for these things, it's about making sure that we're on automated scheduling. It's about making sure that we've got automation around remediation of endpoints as they come out of compliance and so on and so forth. So I think I don't think we really need to discuss too much around this one, guys. But is there any other additional thoughts you want to kind of throw in here, Alex or Kenny?
It's interesting. I remember I read a report last year the federal government did on essentially compliance from federal agencies and so on. And patching applications was actually the most. They said there was the least. There was the least uptake for that particular control. And as to why that is, I'm not too sure. I'm not particularly sure if that's perhaps something that people are just stubborn about changing, or they don't see the benefits in. Perhaps they haven't been illustrated enough. Yeah, it's just an interesting little fact.
Yeah. Right, Kenny, do you have any comments on that one, or it's pretty standard, right?
Yeah, no, it's pretty standard. I was going to mention though that look, it's a great starting point to start with the ASD Essential 8. It's fundamental from a basic cyber hygiene perspective, and we basically started this conversation saying that we can thwart more than 98% of the cyber attacks if we get the basic cyber hygiene right. What we're actually increasingly finding, though, is that once we've gotten the basic cyber hygiene right, then a zero trust strategy really helps. Thinking about your deployments or your entire digital estate, whether it's multi-cloud, multi-platform, iOS, Android, Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever the platforms are, or whatever clouds you're actually using, whether you're using Salesforce or a Microsoft service or a GCP service or AWS or whatever you're actually using. It really helps to think about it with the lens of zero trust. So how are we ensuring that we have the identity controls in place? How are we ensuring we have the endpoint security taken care of, data security, application security, network security, infrastructure security? So I'll post a link to a zero trust journey that we did at Microsoft. So whenever we have a conversation with organizations across Australia and New Zealand about getting the basic cyber hygiene right, the next step in that journey is how we create a concerted strategy or plan for the organization to progress on their zero trust journey. Because once you're actually on the other side of the zero trust journey, you basically have a cybersecurity model that's incredibly robust, irrespective of what device is being used, what cloud is being used, or what location the requests are actually coming from.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd actually just do a very quick call out to that, Chris.
No, it's good. It's good. Mark, here we go. Kenny can talk for hours on this one. Now, macros, right? We all know that macros are a bad thing. We all know that macros are a very easy security risk, right? And it's a really easy way to mitigate it by simply not allowing them to run. There's obviously other components to that, but there is an immediate control in place that you can implement through Defender to make sure that you're compliant with this particular control. So it is something to be mindful of. Macros, if you've got a macro-enabled organization, it's about understanding your risks and understanding your mitigation requirements, right? So when you look at the Essential 8 from a macros perspective and an Office macros perspective, bear that in mind, right? Obviously, it's a framework. If you can't be maturity level 3 here, that could be mitigated through risk management, right? So it's about making sure that we remember that. I actually just realized we're getting close to time here, so we might have to speed up a little bit on our conversations here. Ultimately, the thing around macros, and guys, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but the default position is if you don't need them, disable them. Make sure that you're not allowing macros to run inside your environment. If you do need to run them, make sure you have an understanding of the risk and the mitigations that you need to put in place. Essential 8 gives you those mitigations, right? Around making sure you understand where they're being signed from and so on. So user application hardening, and this kind of leans more towards Kenny's conversation earlier about Smart App inside Windows 11 or things like Threat Locker, where you might do an advanced hardening of applications around your MOE or SOE. Also making sure that the applications that users are allowed to run are being run in a secured manner, right? Now, the user resistance to this is always about the fact that it's, we've got developers in-house at cubesys and they use VS Code as their IDE, but they can't run certain plugins because of the application hardening that's occurred around it. So, it becomes a blocker for some people. So it's about understanding, once again, having a line of communication with your users and understanding that that's what we need to do. Gents, any quick thoughts around application hardening? Maybe Kenny first.
Yeah, so look, it's very topical. I just posted a link to the attack surface reduction rules. So they really help. And then the other thing I'll also suggest is that there's comprehensive capability now available to look at different vulnerabilities at an application level, at an operating system level. So with Defender for Endpoint, there's a vulnerability management capability built into it. So you can basically see what the vulnerabilities are, and you can harden the applications accordingly, right? So if you look at the attack surface reduction rules, you look at some of the vulnerability management capabilities in Defender for Endpoint, with a combination of all of those things, that can actually go a long way in hardening the applications and resolving those vulnerabilities. So what we also do with vulnerability management is that we'll actually give you, when we find a vulnerability, if it's a publicly known vulnerability, we'll even give you the numbers for the CVE, which is the vulnerability identification number. So you'll get that as well, right? So there's a whole raft of information available on the real-time scanning of operating systems, of applications, and all the different components on the endpoint.
Yep. Excellent. Cool. All right. Restrictive administrative privileges. Again, we need to have a good communication with our users. That's going to be a user resistance again, because again, we're restricting what they can do and how they can do it. The upfront cost here can be a little bit tricky. Obviously, by doing more restrictive, by being more restrictive on our end users, we're also requiring our IT operations teams to be more involved, right? So the more restrictive, the less permissive we are to our end users, the more our IT operations or our IT administrators have to be involved with doing elevated privileges or elevated actions inside the environment. So it's always be mindful about when we're taking the maturity levels of this one into account as to what is acceptable for what we're trying to achieve from a maturity level, but also what is going to be the impact on the flip side of that to our internal team around how much more workload we're potentially creating for them. So it is something to be mindful of and be aware of. Ultimately, there is things like just-in-time access for certain components, and that zero trust. If you look at Kenny's information around zero trusts, will show you ways of achieving restrictive access, but also about enabling your users to do what they need to with just-in-time access when they need to. So it's about making that, I guess, awareness and compromise around when we're doing that. Patching operating systems, we'll talk about very briefly. Again, patching operating systems, good practice. Keep your environment patched and up to date. It's very similar to the application controls. I don't think there's much really to talk about there. I would encourage people that if they're still using SCCM, that they make sure that is up to date, make sure that the environment around what you're using to patch your operating systems is also up to date, because sometimes that can introduce additional security risks. And again, the attack landscape and the surface reduction would be a key component there. Multi-factor. This is another conversation which I'm sure that all three of us can have very long-winded conversations around. Multi-factor is a necessity. I think it's very well known inside the industry and amongst all of us attending today that multi-factor is by far one of the strongest methods to thwart attacks, but when not implemented correctly, can be the easiest way to sometimes gain access and to gain that attack level. I open it up very briefly to Kenny and Alex around this one. Multi-factor is here to improve, right? It's not here to go away. It's not going to, it's here to stay. We're going to improve it. One of the things I wanted to talk about here was the human element of multi-factor, but also the non-human element of multi-factor. We all use app notifications now. There's now been a swing away from that a little bit to enhance app notifications to a prompt to stop the app fatigue component where they're just approving it, not remembering if they've actually requested it. So to Alex and Kenny, guys, what's your thoughts around MFA when we're looking at maybe maturity level 2s and 3s? We're thinking about how we implement MFA and the impact it's using or on our users.
Yeah, definitely. We've got like the security manager is one of its core sort of components is workflows and reports and dashboards based around auditing MFA. How is it configured? Is it configured in a recommended manner? And then rolling through some scripts to roll it out. Obviously, there's the easier impact that's got to be considered. You can't just go enabling MFA, at least without notifying your customers, but MFA is a core component, probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest risk mitigators today. And as such, our security manager heavily pushes MFA configuration along Microsoft's recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And look, I'll just add to what Alex was actually saying that there's a couple of components that we actually see being very critical components or critical elements of a successful multi-factor authentication strategy. The first element is to ensure that MFA doesn't cause fatigue. So where I'm going with that is that I think most of you would have probably heard about the Azure AD conditional access policy. And this goes back to the zero trust conversation. So essentially what I'm alluding to is that if we put a multi-factor authentication prompt in place for every single access scenario, what we actually find is that causes a lot of fatigue in users, right? So every single time they actually have to access something, they have to go through username, password, biometrics, or a multi-factor authentication or a second factor of authentication. It gets to a point where users will actually just approve the second factor of authentication, which kind of negates the use of multi-factor authentication. So very intentional multi-factor authentication. If you look at something like Azure AD conditional access, what it basically does is it actually says in these specific scenarios, well, I'll give you an example. If the user is not on the corporate environment or not connected in through a VPN or a similar mechanism, if the user is on an unmanaged device, if the location is a location that we haven't seen before, then prompt for multi-factor authentication. Right, so being very intentional about what those risk cases are, what those edge cases are, where you should implement multi-factor authentication, because we do want to avoid that fatigue at any cost. And then the second element that I'd also like to bring up is it depends how you do the multi-factor authentication. So biometrics, whether you use the Microsoft Authenticator app or for that matter, some other authenticator app, that's a lot more secure than a text message or an email message, right? Because text messages, someone can actually steal the SIM. It's not very difficult to steal the SIM. And someone can probably compromise someone's email address, right? So those factors are not, we don't recommend those factors as great practices for cybersecurity. Our recommendation always is to use biometrics or to use one of these authenticator apps. Yeah. So so those would be the two callouts on MFA.
Yeah, and Windows Hello, right, is a big part of that journey when it comes to that multi-factor, having a dedicated PIN to the device, but has a biometric element as well to it. So again, decoupling the authentication from the individual and to the device and or the additional factors that we have on place. Yeah, very important. Thanks, guys. That moves us on to backups, which now Alex is he's just going to take over the conversation now and talk for hours on this one as well. But ultimately, we all know that backups are really important. Now, there's very little resistance from users because they don't necessarily know what's happening. But sometimes it's a bit of a cost prohibitive approach, especially when we get to the cloud. Right, we're now talking about we don't have a data center where we paid millions of dollars for all our storage that we're just going to write off over 5 years. So the cost of storage is now being included inside our operational budgets and understanding that. So look, there are expensive options, there are cheaper options, there are middle of the line options. They all have their different pros and cons. Alex, obviously, Skykick is a big player in this space with the partners. And Kenny, Microsoft just released a Office 365 backup product into private preview. So, hopefully next year we'll probably see that come out of private into public and then into GA with some time. But to you, Alex, obviously daily backups is an important component of any protect and recover strategy. What are the other gotchas around backup?
Well, I mean, like you said, it plays a pretty crucial role in any sort of protection from potential loss, and then that could be from hardware malfunction. Well, not so much with cloud, but from identity theft, information theft, accidental deletion, data corruption, all sorts of stuff. I suppose Skykick's fairly competitive in that space in the way that we're quite aligned with Microsoft. So the solutions were built and engineered in the Microsoft cloud. So all the data is stored on Azure, for instance. So there's no ingress, egress costs or time. Restores are quick and easy. It now allows us to reduce our costs, which then we pass on to the partner, which passes on to the customer. In terms of the gotchas, I suppose it just comes down to the feature wars, as they say, with some of our competitors. Users are getting more and more canny about what specific features their cloud backups have, and the challenge there is to be able to provide as best a service for the end customer as possible via supporting our partners as best we can.
Yeah, no, good call out. Good call out. I'll open it up. I'm not sure we're going to have much time for a Q&A, given we're about to wrap up. But I really want to quickly, obviously, highlight cubesys, and want to also take time to thank everybody coming today. Alex and Kenny, you guys have been fantastic today. It's been great to have more of a natural conversation around ASD and almost demystifying it for hopefully some of our viewers today. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Look, I think the one final thought from me, I'll actually include two parts in that thought, and I'll be quick about it, is one, let's please ensure that we get our cyber hygiene right. It's not very difficult to do with the ASD Essential 8 because obviously it's laid out what are the critical components that we need to think about. And then the zero trust strategy, right? So being very intentional about how we all move to a zero trust paradigm, because that's the industry best practice right now. And I'll actually post a link to the zero trust journey as well.
No, thank you. Yeah. Alex, any final thoughts from yourself?
I think security is important now more than it's ever been, and the Essential 8 is a great, easy to understand and break down framework for deploying that security. Maturity level 1 can be quite simple to put into practice, and I mean the benefits far outweigh the costs for sure. So definitely encouraged.
Excellent. Look, and thank you everyone for attending today. I know that we had to rush a small section of it, but ultimately, and please feel free to reach out to any of us and ask the questions that you may have. Our details are going to be obviously attached to the meeting invites and so on and so forth. Please reach out to us on LinkedIn to ask any questions that you may have, or via email. Any of those that have questions for anything else, again, feel free. And if you need help understanding ASD in a more detailed way, please reach out to myself or Ashta from cubesys or Claire from cubesys, and we'll be more than happy to set up a conversation with you guys. Thank you everyone for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.